It looked like a standard international employment contract. A $16,000 monthly salary, a private apartment, a legal work visa. But buried in Section 7, Clause 3, was a single sentence that transferred full guardianship of the signee to the employer. She was holding a perfectly legal document for human trafficking. This is how modern slavery begins, not with chains, but with signatures and devastating fine print. This isn't a fictional thriller. It's a global criminal enterprise generating $150 billion annually, targeting the most vulnerable with fake job ads for nursing, construction, and cruise ship work. The question isn't how this happens, but why we never see the victims living next door. To understand, we must follow one offer from a gleaming corporate website to the locked room where the contract becomes a cage. It begins with a dream, and a recruiter who knows exactly how to sell it. Her name was Anya. Before the contract, she was a 28-year-old registered nurse in Manila, supporting her parents and younger sister on a salary of $350 a month. The recruitment ad promised 15 times that, a lifeline she couldn't afford to ignore. It appeared on a professional job portal she trusted. Elite Medical Staffing International sought qualified nurses for a 5-star private hospital in Dubai. The photos showed pristine hallways, smiling staff, and a starting monthly salary of $5,200, plus housing and airfare. For Anya, it was the answer to a decade of prayers. The application process felt reassuringly rigorous. She submitted her credentials, had 3 Zoom interviews with a polite HR manager named David, and underwent a thorough background check. The offer letter arrived as a sleek PDF. The terms were astounding: a 3-year contract, the promised salary, a shared company apartment, and a $10,000 sign-on bonus to be paid after 6 months of service. The only unusual requirement was a $6,000 professional placement and visa processing fee to be deducted from her first year's earnings. David explained it was standard for premium placements. When your current reality is a 12-hour hospital shift for $12, a future debt feels like a problem for your future, richer self. Anya wired her life savings, $800, as a deposit. This is the critical vulnerability traffickers exploit, the desperation gap. The International Labor Organization estimates 28 million people are in forced labor globally. The recruitment funnel starts by targeting countries with high unemployment and low wages, then overwhelming logic with life-changing numbers. The victim's own hope becomes the trap. The red flags were there, but they were framed as marks of exclusivity. David insisted on using the agency's own notary to witness the signing, bypassing her usual lawyer. The contract was 42 pages of dense legal English, which Anya's conversational English couldn't fully decipher. David assured her the key points were exactly as discussed. When she asked about the clause concerning guardianship and administrative control, he waved it off. Just a Dubai residency requirement, darling. All our nurses sign it. It's for your protection. Protection. That word would echo in her mind later. She signed on a Thursday. On Friday, her passport was collected for visa processing. On Monday, David informed her the flight was booked for Wednesday, a sudden rush that raised her first real tremor of anxiety. When she asked to see the visa copy, he said it would be given to her at the airport. Company protocol for security. The pressure was now tangible. Backing out would mean losing her deposit and facing her family's shattered hopes. So she packed 2 suitcases, hugged her crying mother, and boarded the Cathay Pacific flight to what she believed was her future. But the operation was already pivoting. This is where the fraudulent contract reveals its true purpose. It isn't designed to create a legal employment relationship. It's designed to create a paper trail that misdirects authorities and strips the victim of recourse. The hospital named in the contract, the Elite Medical Staffing Agency, these were front companies, part of a layered network designed to dissolve upon investigation. The real destination was not a hospital in Dubai, but a compound in Riyadh. Upon landing, Anya was not met by an agency representative. 2 stern men in civilian clothes held a sign with her name, They took her passport and suitcases, saying they were her logistics team. The car drove not toward the glittering city center, but into an industrial district, finally stopping at a walled residential compound. Her new apartment was a room in a shared villa with 5 other women, all looking similarly bewildered. There were no hospital orientations. Instead, a manager arrived and handed them new contracts. "There's been an administrative change," he said. "You'll be working as home health aides for private families. Sign here." The new contract was in Arabic. The promised salary was slashed to $900 a month. The placement fee had ballooned to $20,000 with crippling interest. When Anya objected, citing her original contract, the manager's demeanor shifted. He produced a copy of the document she'd signed in Manila. His finger tapped Clause 7, subsection 3. "You agreed that the company may reassign your role and adjust compensation based on operational needs at its sole discretion. You also agreed that all disputes will be handled through private arbitration in Dubai. You have no standing here." The legal trap had sprung. The document she signed was not a job offer. It was a surrender of autonomy. For 2 weeks, Anya and the others were kept in the villa, fed minimal food, subjected to daily training that was mostly intimidation. Their passports were locked in a safe. Phone use was monitored. The debt was recited to them like a mantra. Attempts to contact the agency found numbers disconnected and email addresses bouncing. They were invisible. This is the precise moment labor trafficking becomes inescapable. The realization that the system you thought would protect you, the contract, the law, the embassy, has been weaponized against you. The U.S. State Department notes that traffickers specifically exploit gaps in foreign labor protections and complex visa sponsorships to create this legal limbo. The final step in the setup is the placement. Anya was told a family had selected her. She was to be a live-in caregiver for an elderly man. The manager presented a third document, a code of conduct for domestic workers. It listed rules like no leaving the house unaccompanied, no personal phone calls, and surrendering her phone for security checks each evening. Failure to comply would result in deductions from her pay toward the ever-growing debt. She was driven to a mansion in a wealthy suburb. The gate closed behind the car with a definitive clang. The woman of the house greeted her not as a medical professional, but as a servant. Her nursing credentials were never mentioned again. Her world had shrunk to the walls of this house, her identity replaced by a debt figure. But the story doesn't end in that house, because the system that trapped Anya has a fragile point. The moment the victim realizes the debt is a fiction, and the only real power the trafficker holds is fear. It would take one audacious, desperate move to test that theory, a move that would expose not just a crime, but an entire international architecture of exploitation. The move was not violent but digital. During her one supervised weekly grocery trip, Anya memorized the 6-digit Wi-Fi password printed on the family's router. That night, using an old tablet they hadn't confiscated, she connected to a hidden guest network and sent a single message to a cousin in Canada with one instruction: find IOM Manila, send them everything. Attached were photos of her contracts, her passport, and the compound's address. Then she deleted the sent message, cleared the browser history, and powered the tablet off. The entire operation took 87 seconds. It was the most dangerous thing she had ever done. For 2 days, nothing happened. Then, on the third day, the household manager's phone began to ring nonstop. This is the first domino. The International Organization for Migration, or IOM, is a UN-related agency that often serves as a first responder in trafficking cases. Anya's cousin had forwarded the documents, and IOM's Manila office immediately initiated a case management file. But here, where the complex reality of international trafficking intervention crashes against the simple hope of rescue, IOM couldn't send police. They couldn't storm the villa. Their protocol is diplomacy and process. They contacted their counterpart in Riyadh, who then had to navigate local sponsorship laws that often treat the worker as the property of the employer. The initial response was a formal inquiry to the Saudi Ministry of Human Resources, which could take weeks. Anya's digital cry for help had entered a bureaucratic labyrinth. Meanwhile, the traffickers' surveillance apparatus flickered to life. The family began acting strangely, whispering in Arabic, watching her more closely. They demanded her tablet for a routine software update. Anya knew this was the moment. If they found the trace of her connection, the consequences were unthinkable. She handed it over, her heart a drum against her ribs. The technician examined it for an hour before returning it, shrugging. He'd found nothing. Anya's simple tactic, using a guest network that didn't require a login and sending data, not a voice call, had bypassed their basic monitoring. But the pressure valve was now released in the wrong direction. The family, spooked by the increased scrutiny from their own agency, decided to move her. Suddenly, she was told to pack. She was being transferred to another family in a different city. This was standard operating procedure for the network. Disrupt the victim's sense of place, sever any fledgling local connections, and reassert total control through dislocation. But the IOM file was now live, and it contained a crucial piece of evidence everyone had missed: the name of the original recruitment agency, Elite Medical Staffing International, and the bank account number used for Anya's deposit. This is where the investigation pivots from a single victim to the architecture of the crime. IOM shared the data with the Philippine government's Interagency Council Against Trafficking. They ran the agency name through their database. It returned no legitimate registration, but the bank account, that was real, and it belonged to a shell corporation registered in Singapore, with a banking trail that led back to a network of over 40 similar staffing agencies across Southeast Asia. Anya wasn't an isolated case. She was transaction number 417 in a ledger that spanned 3 years. The revelation exposes the business model. This isn't a small-time crime. It's a scalable, franchise-like operation. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime reports that 74% of trafficking cases involve organized criminal groups. They operate like any multinational. They have recruitment divisions, logistics teams for transport and housing, legal facilitators to create fraudulent documents, and enforcement arms to manage the assets, the victims. The profit isn't just from the victim's unpaid labor. It's multi-layered: the upfront placement fees, the inflated debt bondage, and the kickbacks from the final employers who pay the agency, not the worker. Anya's $20,000 debt was pure profit, an accounting fiction designed to enslave. As Anya was driven to her new location, a parallel operation was launching in Manila. Anti-trafficking task force officers, acting on the IOM lead, executed a raid on the address listed for Elite Medical Staffing. They found a nondescript office suite, empty except for a single desk, a computer, and a shelf of fake industry awards. The computer's hard drive had been wiped clean, but in the trash, they found a crumpled receipt from a nearby print shop. The shop owner, when shown photos, identified a regular customer, a man named David Chen. He ordered hundreds of copies of professional-looking contracts and company letterheads for various business names over the past 2 years. The description matched David, Anya's recruiter. They had a real name. Back in Saudi Arabia, Anya's new placement was a darker echo of the first. The family was more restrictive, the walls higher. Her spirit, which had flared with hope during her message, began to dim under the weight of this new, more secure prison. The system seemed impenetrable, but the traffickers had made a critical error. In their haste to move her, they'd placed her in a city where the local IOM office had a particularly determined caseworker named Khalid. Khalid received the transfer notice and saw the pattern. A skilled nurse moved abruptly after an IOM inquiry. He switched tactics. Instead of another ministerial letter, he used personal contacts within the Saudi family's own extended network. He discovered the family had a cousin who was a prominent doctor uncomfortable with the arrangement. Khalid appealed to him, not as a law enforcement issue, but as a humanitarian and professional one. You have a qualified nurse acting as a maid. This is a waste of talent and a sin, he argued. This approach, leveraging local social codes and shame, opened a back channel that government documents could not. Then, the second major pivot occurred, reframing the entire case. While tracing David Chen's finances in Manila, investigators found regular payments from his shell company to a corporate services firm in the United Arab Emirates. That firm, in turn, was a subsidiary of a larger holding company with investments in Philippine construction, hospitality, and crucially, manpower export. The board of that holding company included a former Philippine congressman and a well-known business tycoon. The trail suggested something horrifying. The trafficking network wasn't just a criminal gang operating in shadows. It was integrated into the legitimate economy. The fake agencies were a profitable division of a larger, seemingly respectable corporation. This is the dark heart of modern labor trafficking. As the U.S. State Department has noted, traffickers often operate behind legitimate business fronts, making prosecution staggeringly difficult and protecting kingpins with layers of corporate anonymity. The personal stakes for Anya now intersected with vast, intimidating institutional power. Khalid's back-channel negotiation worked. The doctor cousin pressured the family. Facing social embarrassment, they agreed to release Anya from her contract for a price. They demanded she pay a termination fee of $5,000 to cover their recruitment costs. It was another extortion, but it was also a crack in the door. Khalid facilitated the payment through IOM's emergency fund, a calculated risk to secure her physical freedom. Anya was driven to a Saudi women's shelter, her passport finally handed over. She was free from the family, but not from the country. Her visa was still tied to the original fraudulent agency, which had now vanished. She was legally stranded. At this precise moment, the investigation in Manila broke open. David Chen was arrested attempting to board a flight to Hong Kong. Under interrogation, he didn't crack like a movie villain. He bargained. He offered to give up his immediate superior in exchange for leniency. His testimony revealed the network's regional structure. Recruiters like him, regional managers who coordinated transport and housing, and a legal team that continuously crafted new contract templates to stay ahead of labor laws. He confirmed the link to the holding company, explaining his role as an independent contractor, paid per head delivered. Each nurse, each factory worker, each domestic helper was a commodity with a price tag. Anya's had been set at $2,000 profit after expenses. With Chen's testimony, authorities moved to freeze the network's bank accounts, but the money was already gone, wire transferred through a series of offshore havens. The corporate front, however, was now exposed to the sunlight of media scrutiny. A major Philippine newspaper, tipped off by sources in the task force, ran an investigative piece naming the holding company and its political connections. The story went viral nationally. Public outrage erupted. The institutional stakes had just exploded from a closed law enforcement case to a full-blown political scandal. For Anya, sitting in the shelter in Riyadh, this public storm was a distant rumble. Her immediate battle was legal purgatory. To get an exit visa, she needed a no-objection certificate from her sponsor, the defunct agency that had trafficked her. It was a cruel circular joke. IOM lawyers worked frantically to find a legal exception. Days turned into weeks. The shelter was safe, but it was another kind of cage, filled with other women with similar stories from Ethiopia, Indonesia, Kenya. Their collective trauma was a palpable weight in the air. Anya began helping them, using her nursing skills to treat their stress-induced ailments. In doing so, she found a shard of her old identity. She was still a caregiver, not a servant. The bridge to the next escalation was built on this small act of reclamation. While volunteering, Anya met another woman, Lena, who had been trafficked to work on a construction site. Lena's story was even more brutal, involving physical violence. But Lena had something Anya didn't: a smartphone her traffickers had failed to find, hidden in the lining of her suitcase. And on it, Lena had secretly recorded audio of her manager threatening workers and discussing shipments of new recruits. This was no longer just about fraudulent contracts. This was evidence of coercion and threats, the key components of the legal definition of trafficking. Anya realized her own case was just the tip of a monstrous iceberg. The decision she faced now was not about her own escape, but about whether to step back into the fight with this new, devastating weapon. Handing this evidence over would put a target on her back once more, and on Lena's. But keeping it meant letting the machine that enslaved them keep grinding. The shelter's quiet hallway stretched before her, a tunnel leading to two very different futures. Anya didn't decide alone. She and Lena sat on a bottom bunk in the shelter, the phone between them, and played the audio file one final time. The manager's voice was crisp with menace. "If anyone tries to run, we have friends in the police. Your bodies will be found in the desert." Anya looked at Lena's bruised arms, then at her own reflection in the dark screen. "We send it," she said, "to everyone." That single audio file would become a skeleton key, unlocking horrors no contract could conceal. They copied the file and, using Khalid's secure connection, sent it to the IOM legal team, the Philippine Task Force, and, in a calculated risk, to the investigative journalist who had broken the corporate story. The evidence was now in the wild. The reaction was immediate and seismic. For law enforcement, this was the missing piece. A fraudulent contract is a civil matter. Threats of violence and implication of law enforcement collusion. That is criminal conspiracy, trafficking defined by force and coercion. The Philippine National Police upgraded the case. The journalist, armed with the audio, published a second piece, this time with a link to an edited clip. The public outrage turned to fury. The holding company's stock price plummeted. The political figures on its board suddenly announced they were stepping back to focus on public service. The corporate facade began to crack under the weight of undeniable criminal evidence. But in the shelter, the atmosphere grew tense. Khalid received a vague but threatening call warning him to mind his business. The women felt watched. The traffickers' network, wounded and exposed, was now dangerous in a new way, a cornered animal. Anya's legal limbo became a security crisis. IOM decided she was no longer safe in the country. They invoked an urgent diplomatic protocol, appealing directly to the Saudi Ministry of Interior for a humanitarian exit visa based on her status as a crime witness. It was a long-shot gambit. While they waited, Anya and Lena were moved to a more secure, undisclosed location. The fight for freedom had become a fugitive hide-and-seek. Then came the wait, it gets worse moment. The journalist, digging deeper with his new notoriety, made a connection that shattered the investigation's scope. He cross-referenced the bank accounts from David Chen's network with a leaked database of offshore shell companies. The trail didn't just lead to a Philippine holding company. It connected to a web of similar entities in Malaysia, Thailand, and the UAE, all funneling money to a single investment fund registered in the British Virgin Islands. That fund's major investor was a European private equity firm with a pristine reputation and billions under management. The stunning implication was that money from pension funds and institutional investors in London and Zurich was indirectly financing and profiting from this trafficking network. The crime was not just in the shadows of the developing world. It was wired into the heart of the global financial system. This revelation changed everything. It meant the network had access to sophisticated legal and financial services that made it virtually firewalled from conventional prosecution. You could arrest 100 David Chens, but the source of capital and the architects of the structure remained untouched in glass-paneled offices thousands of miles away. The private equity firm issued a swift, outraged denial, claiming they were passive investors and victims of fraud themselves. But the seed of doubt was planted. The story was now about more than exploited migrants. It was about the hidden cost of opaque global capital. The fallout reached Anya in an unexpected way. The Saudi ministry, embarrassed by the international media spotlight and the audio evidence of police corruption, fast-tracked her exit visa. The path home was suddenly clear, but as Anya packed the few belongings she had, a hollow feeling settled in her stomach. Going home meant returning to the same economic desperation that made her vulnerable in the first place. It also meant leaving the fight unfinished. The system that had trapped her was wounded, but its roots, the financial architecture, the corporate veils, were still intact. Her personal escape felt like a Pyrrhic victory. On the flight back to Manila, a new idea began to form, born of equal parts trauma and clarity. She had been a nurse, then a victim, then a witness. What if she could be something else? What if the expertise she'd gained, the specific knowledge of the fraud, the contracts, the psychological manipulation, could be weaponized not just in a court, but in the very communities being targeted? She thought of her cousin in Canada, the one who had received her first message, a software engineer. Anya sketched an idea on a napkin, a platform where migrant workers could vet job offers, where contracts could be analyzed against a database of known fraudulent clauses, where a community could warn each other in real time. It was a digital immune system for the desperate. Back in the Philippines, she was greeted as a minor celebrity by the press and a hero by anti-trafficking NGOs. But the institutional battle was reaching a fever pitch. The task force, armed with Chen's testimony, the audio evidence, and the financial trail, filed a landmark case. They charged the holding company, not just its fake subsidiary, with large-scale illegal recruitment and trafficking. They also named the former congressman on its board as a conspirator. It was the first time the Philippine government had dared to prosecute such high-profile figures in a trafficking case. The courtroom became a theater of war. The traffickers' countermove was as ruthless as it was predictable. David Chen, awaiting trial in a Manila jail, was found dead in his cell. The official report called it suicide. No one believed it. It was a message. Witnesses are disposable. The message was received. Other potential witnesses in the case grew terrified. The legal momentum stalled. The institutional fight was being dragged back into the underworld, where the network's enforcement arm held sway. The task force realized they were no longer just building a case. They were in a conflict. It was at this nadir that Anya's idea found its purpose. She connected with a tech nonprofit and shared her napkin sketches. They were captivated. Here was a solution that attacked the problem at its source, the information asymmetry between recruiter and recruit. They began developing a prototype app, with Anya providing the attack vectors, the exact phrases, fee structures, and clauses that had fooled her. They called it Sandiwa, meaning spirit or conscience. But as they worked, Anya understood the app alone was a band-aid. The real power was in the data it would collect, a live map of predatory recruitment. This led to the final, pivotal escalation of Act 2. A coalition of NGOs, including the one building Sandiwa, decided to pool their data from thousands of victim interviews and undercover investigations. They created a master map of trafficking routes, recruitment hubs, and money flows. When they overlaid this map with the financial data from the journalists' investigation, a terrifying pattern emerged. The flows converged on specific ports, free trade zones, and logistics centers in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, places with lax regulations and high corruption. The network wasn't random. It was parasitic, following the infrastructure of legitimate global trade. The traffickers were using the world's shipping routes, banking channels, and economic zones as their own supply chain. This meant the very systems that powered globalization were also enabling its darkest shadow economy. Armed with this macro view, the coalition made an audacious move. They bypassed national governments altogether and took their evidence to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Their argument was novel, that systematic, large-scale human trafficking by criminal organizations, when condoned or abetted by state inaction, could constitute a crime against humanity. It was a long-shot legal theory, but its purpose was not immediate prosecution. It was to create a political shockwave, to frame trafficking not as a series of local crimes, but as a transnational security threat on par with terrorism or drug cartels. The story was now global, and the stakes were the attention of the world's highest judicial body. Anya stood at the center of this gathering storm. She was no longer just a survivor telling her story. She was a consultant to an app, a source for investigators, and a symbol for a growing movement. The personal and the systemic had completely fused. The night before she was to give a keynote speech at an international anti-trafficking forum, she reviewed her notes. She realized her entire journey, from signing the contract to mapping its financial roots, had given her a unique blueprint. She understood the monster not just from inside its belly, but from a satellite view of its entire ecosystem. The closing of Act Two is not with a bang, but with a chilling realization of scale and the quiet, determined breath before the final push. The battle lines were drawn, in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in the code of apps, and in the court of world opinion. The payoff would be measured not in a single verdict, but in whether a system built on exploitation could be forced to change its very rules. Anya stepped onto the stage in Geneva, her notes trembling in her hands. The audience was a sea of diplomats, NGO workers, and global press. She began not with her nightmare, but with a question. What is the price of a life in the global economy? My contract said $16,000 a year, but the real cost was calculated in silence. That speech would become the catalyst for a reckoning no one saw coming. She didn't just recount her story, she deconstructed it. She showed slides of the contract clauses, explained the debt bondage math, and played a snippet of Lena's audio. Then she unveiled the early prototype of the Sandiwa app, calling it a digital antibody created by survivors for the vulnerable. The room was utterly still. By the time she finished, the personal had irrevocably shaped the political. The first consequence was legal, but not in the way anyone expected. The International Criminal Court did not open a full investigation. The legal bar was too high, but the act of submitting the evidence had its intended shockwave. It prompted the ICC prosecutor to issue a public statement calling for member states to strengthen their anti-trafficking laws and cross-border cooperation. This formal, high-level attention created political cover for national agencies. In the Philippines, the stalled case against the holding company was resurrected under intense public and diplomatic pressure. The court, citing the overwhelming evidence of a sophisticated criminal enterprise, allowed the prosecution to use the financial trail and the audio evidence. The trial became a landmark. The corporate dominoes began to fall. The European private equity firm, facing shareholder revolts and regulatory scrutiny in its home country, conducted an internal audit. They discovered that their passive investment had indeed been channeled through multiple opaque layers into sectors with high trafficking risks. While they denied criminal intent, they publicly divested from the entire fund and donated 20 million euros to anti-trafficking initiatives, including a grant to scale the Sandiwa app. It was a classic reputational salvage operation, but it had a concrete effect. It severed a major artery of capital for the network. The business model relied on clean money from the West. Without it, the profit margins evaporated. Then came the verdict in Manila. After a 2-year trial, the holding company was found guilty of large-scale illegal recruitment and human trafficking. It was fined the equivalent of $10 million, a fraction of its worth, but a symbolic blow. More importantly, the former congressman on its board was convicted of conspiracy. He was sentenced to life in prison. It was the first time a politician of his stature had been held criminally accountable for trafficking in the Philippines. The message was seismic. Corporate veils would no longer provide absolute protection. David Chen's death in jail was reinvestigated, leading to the dismissal of several corrupt prison officials. The network's enforcement arm was being dismantled from within. The Sandiwa app, powered by the NGO Coalition and Anya's insights, launched across Southeast Asia. In its first year, it was downloaded over 500,000 times. Its contract scanning feature, which flagged clauses like unilateral reassignment and compound interest fees, flagged 30% of uploaded job offers as high risk. Community reports on the app's map led to the preemptive shutdown of 19 fake recruitment agencies before they could ship a single victim. The app wasn't a silver bullet, but it radically shifted the odds. It turned the desperate, isolated job seeker into a connected node in a protective network. Anya's napkin sketch was now a functioning shield. But the most profound payoff was systemic and quieter. The coalition's master map of trafficking routes was shared with Interpol and the World Customs Organization. This led to targeted operations in key ports and free zones. In one major interception in Singapore, authorities acting on a tip prevented 200 migrant workers from being boarded onto a ship bound for a fraudulent fishing operation. The workers carried contracts nearly identical to Anya's. The prevention of crime, not just the prosecution, became a new focal point. The narrative was changing from rescue to preemption. Anya's life transformed. She became the director of survivor-led initiatives at the NGO that built Sandiwa. She hired other survivors, including Lena, who was now safe in the Philippines. They trained government agencies, spoke at banks about financial red flags, and consulted for tech companies on ethical AI. Anya never returned to nursing in a hospital. Instead, she healed a system. Her salary was a fraction of what that Dubai contract had promised, but the value was immeasurable. The debt that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a different kind of ledger, one measured in lives protected. Now for the final, surprising detail. A year after the holding company's conviction, a sealed envelope arrived at the NGO's office. Inside was a memory stick and an anonymous note that read, "For Sandiwa, to make the map more complete." The stick contained internal accounting files from the defeated trafficking network, spreadsheets, wire transfer records, and encrypted contact lists for suppliers of fraudulent documents. It was a treasure trove of intelligence. The handwriting on the note was analyzed but yielded no matches. The prevailing theory among investigators was that it came from a mid-level finance manager within the network's corporate structure, someone who had seen the conviction of the congressman and realized the walls were closing in. This whistleblower, hiding in plain sight, had decided to burn the house down on their way out. The files were integrated into Sandiwa's database, making its algorithms sharper and its warnings more precise. The monster, in its death throes, had handed over the blueprint to its own destruction. The story that began with a signature on a fraudulent contract closes with a different kind of signature, the indelible mark left by courage on a system designed to be faceless. The clause that sought to erase Anya's identity ultimately helped expose an entire architecture of exploitation. The payoff here is not a perfect world. Trafficking persists. The payoff is a proven blueprint that a single victim's testimony, when amplified by technology, fueled by data, and backed by relentless institutional pressure, can force a crack in the foundation. It shows that the most potent weapon against a crime of secrecy is relentless, informed transparency. The fight is not over. New networks emerge, new frauds are drafted, but the terms of engagement have changed. The vulnerable are no longer completely in the dark. The corporations know they can be touched. The politicians know they can be jailed. And somewhere right now, a person is reading a job offer on their phone, hesitating over a clause they don't understand. They open an app, scan the document, and a red warning flashes on the screen. High risk, clause pattern matches known labor trafficking indicators. They close the tab. They are safe. That is the real living payoff. That is the sound of a system starting to heal itself, one prevented tragedy at a time. So what does this mean for the 28 million still in the shadows? Anya's story is not an endpoint, but a proof of concept. It reveals that our global economy has a hidden immune system, and it's made of whistleblowers, data, and relentless pressure. The anonymous envelope, the journalist connecting financial dots, the coder building an app, these are not random acts. They are pressure points in a system that can be made to feel pain. The fight against trafficking is no longer just about raiding compounds. It's fought in the fine print of contracts, in the algorithms of screening software, in the due diligence of investment funds, and in the political will to prosecute the powerful. It is a distributed networked battle against a distributed networked crime. Every time a clause is flagged, a money trail is mapped, or a corrupt official is jailed, the cost of doing this business goes up. The profit margin for exploitation narrows. This documentary began with a single line of text in a contract designed to erase a human being. It ends with a map, a living, digital map that grows smarter with every warning it gives and every report it receives. The signature that was meant to seal a fate is now a lesson in a database. This is the new frontline, turning the traffickers' own tools of complexity and secrecy against them. Your awareness is part of this ecosystem. Recognizing the red flags in a job ad, understanding that an offer that seems too good to be true always is, supporting ethical businesses, and demanding transparency from corporations and governments. These actions add friction to the machine. You are a node in the network, just as vital as the coder or the caseworker. If you want to see more stories that expose the hidden systems shaping our world, stories that go from a single shocking detail to a global revelation, hit subscribe. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what surprised you most. By sharing this knowledge, you help ensure that the next Anya sees the warning before she signs her name. The story continues, and it needs every witness it can get.